I wanted to come on today and talk about my personal history with the PlayStation 3. PlayStation 3 was the first console to launch during a period of my life when I started to consider myself a complete functional adult. I had a full time job at the time, and I was in the process of purchasing my first home. I had been accepted to grad school, so it was a time of maturity and also a time of change in my life. So it launched in November of 2006, and at that time I knew that I was going to close on my house in the spring, move in the spring, so I didn't pick it up right at launch. And I remember kind of the launch craziness and people waiting on lines. It was a little bit scarce. I believe it came out like a couple days apart from the Wii, and that was scarce. And I kind of told myself that I was going to sit this one out, even though this would have been the first time that I could have afforded to buy it right on launch night if I could get my hands on it. But I figured, okay, I need to have a little bit of discipline and just wait until I was more settled. So I kind of looked at it from a distance. Of course, I read the reviews, I looked at the launch games, and I more or less kind of figured out, okay, what games do I want to pick up right away? And of course, this was a time of the transition to high definition. So I was still gaming on a 27-inch Sony CRT, which, of course, these days we have a lot of nostalgia for those models, but I would say back then I was really waiting to make the HD jump. No one in my family or even friend circle at that point had an HD TV, so I was really looking forward to all of this when I moved. And so we'll fast forward a little bit to the move. I close on my house in, I believe it was May of 2007, and moved to North Carolina. So coming from the cold times in New York to the warm, sunny South was exciting. And remember, I got down there, closed, moved whatever stuff I had in. I didn't have a lot of furniture. I was kind of living out of boxes and a mattress on the floor and all of that. But the very next day, I went to the Best Buy in Durham, North Carolina. I believe it was on Guess Road in Durham, North Carolina, and I picked up my PlayStation 3. Now, I should probably note that, and this was really kind of crazy to think about that I did this all in such a short period of time, but I believe like the day before, so this would have been like closing in the morning, I believe the night before, I had my first HD television delivered. And this TV was kind of an odd model. It was a Samsung LED DLP HD TV. So back in those days, you had more or less two mainstream choices for this new emerging HD technology. And I say new and emerging, but HD had been out for a while. I wasn't obviously an early adopter, but just kind of in this time frame, you had the old school LCD TVs, you had the super high-end plasma televisions like Philips, Panasonic, plasma TVs, Pioneer, Curo TVs kind of being the absolute top-notch. So I couldn't afford the absolute top-notch, but I wanted something better than those early LCDs, and I found projection televisions and this new Samsung technology. So it wasn't kind of like the old school 3-bulb projectors. It was a DLP chip, rear projection, so it was a little bit slimmer, it was a little bit lighter. Went with the 50-inch model, and what it could do is really reproduce super vibrant color. I think it even had some early 3D capabilities. It wasn't HDR as we know it today, but it had an expanded dynamic range, over 1 billion colors. Like, this was the best affordable, or at least affordable to me, TV that I could find. So got that all set up the night before, and then the very next day, I get my PlayStation 3. So I'm going to talk about the games that I picked up in that window of, say, like the first year to a year and a half. The first two games that I got with it were Virtua Tennis 3 and the first MotorStorm game. But I'm going to get into the games in a little bit. I want to start, however, talking about the hardware itself. And the PlayStation 3, now there were two models at the time, as I recall. There was, I think, the 20 gigabyte model and the 60 gigabyte model. So I had to get the 60 gigabyte model. The price was $600, and this was a really, really expensive console. Adjusted for inflation today, that would be about $878, and if we want to look at pre-COVID dollars, it'd be about $737. So this was super expensive. Still to this day, the most that I've ever spent on a console. You throw in the two games, that's an extra $120, extra controller. I think that was all that I got. So, it's kind of pushing towards that $1,000 range. Plus, I had to get the TV. So I was now all ready for the HD revolution. But getting back to the hardware. So what did that 60 gigabyte model have? Well, it had the built-in Wi-Fi. I think the cheapest model didn't have Wi-Fi, or you needed an adapter, so I had to have that. It also was one of the models with the hardware-based PlayStation 2 emulation. So it actually put the PS2 chip, graphics chip, processing chip in the PS3, and I think the later ones didn't have that. They had some kind of software-based emulation. But this version was compatible, I believe, with like every PlayStation 2 game. And that was important to me because I was heavily invested in the PlayStation 2 library. If you've looked on the channel, my personal history video on the PlayStation 2, I think to this day it's the system for which I have the most games. So I was excited about that. It obviously had the Blu-ray support. It had the expanded storage, which I thought was important. It had all of the card readers on the front, which I thought was very cool. It even had SACD support, high-definition CD format, and I even had some of those, although kind of like very few devices had that support. And I mean, to this day, SACDs are super expensive. But what I think it represented was what I remember people talking about back then as being a media convergence device. It could play legacy games in the PlayStation 2. It could play, and I want to say also PlayStation 1. I might be wrong about that. I can't remember playing too many PlayStation 1 games, but the hardware of the PS2 could emulate PlayStation 1. But let's just say legacy support PlayStation 2. It had the DVD support, so legacy physical media for films. It obviously had regular and high-definition audio support. And then, of course, you add in the Blu-ray, which was extremely exciting at that time. We were right in the middle of the war between HD, DVD, and Blu-ray. And, of course, Xbox eventually supported HD DVD with that add-on. But I was like, oh, PlayStation's got it built in. I'm going to join the Blu-ray camp. So it was very forward-looking in that regard. It was also the first device, or at least the first device that I had, that could be kind of like a front end for all of your digital media with those card readers. So you could have your whole audio collection on there. You could have the family photos. And of course, what I used it for was like ripping my DVD collection and having digital video files and being able to play all of those back. And then, of course, it could stream with the Wi-Fi. I still have the Netflix disc. They would send you a disc that you would need to stream Netflix online. So it could do all of those things. It was a transitional device. It was a bridge device from one era of media consumption to another. But it was convergence. It was that time when you could bring everything into one device. And it was very exciting for that. And then you look at the design itself. I think this is one of the best looking consoles to have ever released. It was a different design. It was a new design. It kind of maintained the PlayStation 2 aesthetic, but it had that glossy piano black look. It felt substantial. I mean, it's super heavy, one of the heaviest consoles that I've ever used. It just exuded quality in a way that very few systems have done. And even today, I mean, I would argue that though the PlayStation 5 has a very unique look and has some heft to it, it still doesn't feel like this. Felt like a piece of elite audio equipment. But to be fair, while we are on the topic of hardware, I do have to talk about some hardware problems that I had with the original PlayStation 3. And I said problems. I had one major problem and then one kind of somewhat minor problem. Major problem. About a year into my ownership of this console, the Blu-ray drive broke. It would no longer read discs. It would just one day it sucked in a disc. It kind of whirred and grumbled and then froze. So my console, this console that I spent over $1,000 at this point because I'd purchased more games, I had purchased some online games, so all of that was lost. It was broken. And I was heartbroken because I couldn't afford to buy a new console by any stretch of the imagination. And I want to say that after that year, the warranty ran out. I don't remember all the details, but I remember calling Sony, and they told me that my warranty had run out. And I think it was like something crazy, like it was like $100 or $150 to ship it in, then a diagnostic fee, and then $150 to ship it back to me. So it wasn't worth it. So my new console, my new beacon of the HD revolution was gone. But I was determined to find some kind of a solution to get this thing to work. And what I did was I researched online, like I looked for schematics on the console. I found every bit of information, technical information I could find about the components. And then somehow I went online. This was probably before the days of like AliExpress. I found in China the manufacturer of the Blu-ray drive. And I ordered just a bare Blu-ray drive for this console. And it was a bit of a risk. It was like maybe it was between $80 to $100. I don't remember, but it's better than paying all that money to Sony to fix it or coming up with another $600 to buy another PlayStation 3. So after a while, it did come. Probably, it was still like boat shipped over. And I had to disassemble this PlayStation 3. And it was very complicated. I mean, there was a lot of disconnecting and small little cables and lots of screws to get to at least the part of the hard drive bay where I could actually disconnect it. But I did it. And I reassembled everything, got the new drive in there, and I didn't screw anything up because it worked. The only thing I did wrong is that I lost the screw that holds the top cover onto the console, and you can kind of see that here, this kind of remnant injury from this whole ordeal. But the console worked, and it worked well, and in fact, it still works to this day. So I reanimated my beloved PlayStation 3. And the second problem, which is not really a problem, but it kind of bothered me, was I would say maybe a year after that, 2009, 2010, something like that, they released an update, system software update. I believe it was the update where it moved away from the old XMB to kind of a newer look. And when you would launch something, or when you would log in, it would actually have like this particle effect that would happen. When that system software update was rolled out, the console got very loud. The fans would spin up, and it just kind of sounded like a jet engine. I could tell it was getting quite a bit hotter. So at that point, I was like, well, I put in all the effort to fix this thing. I don't want it to break. I'm going to retire this fat PlayStation 3 and then go with the PlayStation 3 Slim, which you can see here. And that kind of became my main PlayStation 3. As far as the PlayStation 2 emulation, I was upset to lose that, but I wound up getting also a PlayStation 2 Slim really cheap, and then that became how I just had that hooked up in another room, and so I could kind of access both libraries. All right, let's get into the games, and I want to talk about the games that were out in, say, the first year to a year and a half, so launch window games, plus a couple of other games that I really spent a lot of time with in the early days of the system, games that capture this time in my life. So I already mentioned that the first games that I picked up were Virtua Tennis 3 and MotorStorm. Virtua Tennis 3 is an interesting one. It was funny, before I moved down to North Carolina, a good friend of mine and I, as kind of like a goodbye trip, we went to an old amusement park and arcade that we had both gone to as kids. It was a place called Beaucraft Playland, I believe it was called. Beaucraft Playland on Route 22 in northern New Jersey, I believe maybe in the Scotch Plains area, something like that. And we hadn't been there since we were maybe 9-10 years old. So I remember that they would have these massive, or they seemed massive when we were kids, arcade tents. And those were gone, but they had the remnants of one of those old arcades in the basement. So it was still functional. We went into the basement. They still had those old, if you remember, the brown coin machines. Didn't have a lot of games, but they had that initial Virtua Tennis arcade game, which I think was also released for the Dreamcast. Good game in its own right. And we played that, and so I'm not going to say I was nostalgic for it, because I don't really remember playing it in the arcades, nor did I have a Dreamcast when that launched. But I don't know, I was like, oh, Virtua Tennis is a really, really good game. And when I saw that they had Virtua Tennis for the PS3, picked it up, and in a lot of ways, this game was the game that showed me the promise of the PlayStation 3, but also ruined the PlayStation 3 for me. I'll explain why. Virtua Tennis 3 was one of those games that actually ran at 1080p. And I recall it ran at 1080p 60. So it was super fluid. It was incredibly, it looked great. It truly looked like, now again, at the time, it looked like a high definition masterpiece of a game from somebody who was playing just a year ago on a 27-inch Sony CRT at sub high definition resolution levels. So this game was incredibly fun. It had a great arcade mode. I love the progression of it with all sorts of different mini games and things like that. This was a fabulous, fabulous game. And MotorStorm was also very good. MotorStorm felt next generation. It had motion blur. It had, for the time, pretty over-the-top collisions. Looking back, it was a 30 FPS game, and having played it recently for this video, I will say that it does not hold up well. But those are the games that I spent a lot of time with, and it was really like, again, I could afford this, but I couldn't afford much more than these two games. So I spent a good amount of time on these games. The third game that I picked up, and it was actually my first downloadable purchase, was Tekken 5 Dark Resurrection. So it was a updated version of Tekken 5 on the PlayStation 2, and it was Tekken as the classic Tekken. I know Tekken now has kind of it's made in, I don't know which modern game engine, but it feels generic. The last Tekken 7 to me felt very generic and not like the last, the great Tekkens of old. So this to me was arcade Tekken again. I don't know if it was 1080p, but it was definitely 60 frames per second. Looked great, played great. Later, when I got some arcade sticks for the PlayStation 3, it worked really well with those, and my mode in this was just simply the endless ghost battle arcade modes, just seeing how many guys I could go through, how many unlocks I could get. I think you could unlock sort of different costumes and things like that. I believe one of the bonuses was that it came with a fairly complete roster at that time. So had a lot of fun with that one. Another highly anticipated and highly played game was Mortal Kombat versus DC Universe. I remember following this game, waiting for it to come out. Probably came out a little bit later than this initial window. It might have been 2008, but it was just one of those games that kind of defined that early part of the console for me. It was arguably the first in the updated Mortal Kombat, Injustice, like that engine, although it was more 3D, it was more Tekken-like, but it had that good Mortal Kombat feel. It felt like Mortal Kombat, when it got to the 3D era, was just lacking in a lot of ways. It didn't feel like it had that visceral pleasure of those initial Mortal Kombat games. And this game had that. It had the announcer, it had like the deep thudding bass on the punches, and it was, I think, one of the first crossover products, or modern crossover fighting game, or at least one of the firsts that I had played and that I spent a lot of time with. Graphically, it looked really good at the time, but I mean, today it's going to pale in comparison to those aforementioned sort of modern games, Injustice 2. Nonetheless, just picking up and sort of moving between that game and Tekken is really emblematic of this time in my life. And this is a truly embarrassing one, Madden 09. Of course, this came out in 2008. And why was I excited, and why did I put time into Madden 09? Well, because Brett Favre was on the cover. Now, Brett Favre, the iconic Green Bay quarterback, had actually been traded to my favorite football team, the New York Jets, and they released this game with Brett on the cover in a Green Bay Packers uniform. So being excited, being ready to see a legendary Green Bay Packer lead the Jets into the promised land, I bought 2 copies, one to play and one to collect. Yes, one to collect for posterity. And, well, now as Jet fans, we find ourselves in a similar position. Will the great Green Bay Packer lead us to glory? We will see. And then I spent a lot of time with Call of Duty 4 Modern Warfare. This was a highly anticipated game, also from that 2007-2008 window. And I really enjoyed this one. I'm not a Call of Duty player. I wasn't drawn to Call of Duty initially because I think up to this release, it had been more or less a World War II type game, whereas Modern Warfare 4 was modern, or it was a modern-day take on the Call of Duty formula, so that attracted me. It was also supposed to be a technical marvel for the next-gen systems, which I would say arguably was true. I mean, I felt like, as somebody who didn't have a powerful PC, I hadn't played a shooter that really looked this good. So I was on board with it. I thought it was a great story. I thought it gave a lot of fun scenarios. I didn't really play it online all that much, but I really liked the single-player game, and I played it not too long ago. I think they re-released it on the Xbox or Xbox Series X, and I got that not too long ago, played it, and it's a quality game, so I really, really enjoyed that. So sticking with the theme of war, I picked up Metal Gear Solid 4, Guns of the Patriots. And those of us with a PlayStation 3 back then were really, really looking forward to this release. This game, even, I recall in the press conferences at E3 that announced the PlayStation 3, they talked about this game, and they said that this was going to be the technological marvel of the new console. I seem to recall reports of the power that was going to go toward, the power of the cell processor, and they said things like there's more computational power going towards Snake's mustache in Metal Gear Solid 4 than there was in a whole level of Metal Gear Solid 3. And did the game deliver? I mean, the game was just a very weird game. I look back at it, and it was Kojima at his finest or most frustrating. I remember a lot of unskippable cutscenes, just sitting there watching it like a movie, like the gameplay when you got to it, but I felt compelled to finish it because this was the game that was going to define the system, and it was satisfying. I don't really recall the ending. I seem to recall like a hand-to-hand combat battle against a boss character on the top of a submarine. That's the fight that I remember. I don't know if that was the last one or not. Haven't gone back to it because I just don't have the time to play through it again. But it was good, and of course, you kind of look at the world now and how military conflicts are evolving, unfortunately. And I think there were some really intelligent insights in this game. But yeah, I'll always look back to this time. It's just one of the games that will stick in my memory. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention another game that came out around the PlayStation 5 launch window. It wasn't a launch game, first-year game, I believe, 2007. The Valve Orange Box, which I always thought was unique because I can't think of too many other Valve console releases. I could be wrong about that, but this is the only one I think that they did. I thought this was such a interesting concept because, again, as somebody who at that time lacked a powerful PC, I could play the first 2 episodes of Half-Life. I could play Team Fortress, and I could play the first Portal game. And so it felt like, as far as this system being a next-gen system, it's allowing me to do something that previously only owners of what I thought anyway were high-end PCs, i.e. PCs capable of serious gaming, which I didn't have. Only those people could play these games. Now I was playing it on the PlayStation 3, and I've got to tell you, the first time that I played Portal, I was really, really taken aback by how creative it was. And still to this day, it's an amazingly creative, amazingly fun game. So the Orange Box was special. And then as the years went on, I always thought, the Orange Box should be a very collectible game. Because, again, how many games has Valve released on console? But it's not. So if you're a Valve fan, and you want kind of a collecting curiosity, I would definitely pick it up. But again, it was one of those games that defined the times for me. Perhaps the game that I spent the most time with on the PlayStation 3 is The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. I've talked about this game quite a bit on the channel, so I'm not really going to go into it here, but I mean this was one of the last times in my life where a game stole my time, where I was playing a game I knew I had other responsibilities in life, but I just had to keep going, and even more so than Metal Gear Solid 4. I felt like this was truly next gen. It was just so big, and it was an experience that I couldn't have on PC because I didn't have the PC to run it. I realize the PC version is infinitely better than the PlayStation 3 version. I think even the Xbox version is better, but for me, this was really the promised land as far as a game that could consume me. And none of these other games did that, but this one did, and it's still one of the fondest gaming memories that I have. There was also Backbreaker. So Backbreaker was a football game. It didn't have the NFL license, and I can't really recall when it came out. This might be like much later. It might be pushing into 2009, but as someone who was a lifelong fan of football games, and as many people were, very upset that EA got the exclusive license to Madden, and honestly, once they did that, beginning with this PlayStation 3, Xbox 360 console generation, the games, in my opinion, got worse and worse and worse. So Backbreaker represented a game that could be the Madden replacement. And it was a game that was trying a lot of different things. It had a totally different physics engine, like at the time it said, an accurate physics engine. No two plays would be the same. It started off as a kind of first-person football. Like it wasn't simulation Madden, and honestly, it was a little clunky to play. But it had, like I said, impressive graphics, impressive physics. Then at some point they had this big update that let you do more with it, that made it more Madden-like, and it had a user creation server, if you want to call it that, where you could download team art, and you could kind of make your own teams and stuff like that. So that's how you got the college teams and the NFL teams in it. It was one of the more ambitious sports games, I would say, of the past 2 decades, even though at the end, gameplay-wise, it never really was that good. But it is something that I definitely spent a lot of time with. And I'll just end with 2 games that are much, much later in release, but that I still feel, when I think of the PlayStation 3, these are games that I spent a lot of time with. The first will be Yakuza 3 and 4, but really also 5, which I played in digital format. And these games are ones that I've talked about many, many times, but it's one of my favorite series, and I put a lot of time into the series on the PlayStation 3. I should also mention, before I go to the last one, Gran Turismo 5, which came out a little bit later than the launch window, but I actually picked up the prologue, and that prologue, I imported it from Japan, so I was playing it much earlier. I want to say late 2008, early 2009, and then GTA 5 came out, I want to say later in 2009 or 2010, and I love the Gran Turismo series. I had a lot of fun unlocking all of the cars in this one. It had a mixture of like really high-def cars and then classics from GT4, and then beyond that, GT6, which I played much, much later. That was one of the later releases anyway, but I actually played that. I had left the house down in North Carolina. I was back up north, and I just have kind of like a strange memory with that game. I had finished or gotten as far as I wanted to go in, I want to say it was the PlayStation 4 Gran Turismo game, which was, I think, Gran Turismo Sport. And I was like, that was an appetizer, but it wasn't a full-fledged Gran Turismo game. So I went back to Gran Turismo 6, bought it digitally, and I remember I had to delete all of my Gran Turismo 5 data, and then Gran Turismo 6, like 5, but even in a more intense way, would install in bits and pieces, and it took up half my hard drive. Anyway, I played it on a night. I was coming home. It was late fall, really rainy and cold. And I remember as I was kind of driving home, I got into a battle with somebody on the road, like a little road rage incident. Someone cut me off, and I honked. And then this guy kind of followed me home and threatened me. And he was like, "Oh, I'll see you later tonight, blah, blah, blah." And so I was a little freaked out. And I was like, well, I got to stay up late, so let me play Gran Turismo 6. And I was playing Gran Turismo 6, and every time I heard something, I was looking out the window. I was like, oh, is this guy coming back? And, he didn't, and that was that. But it was all just, that was my last kind of in-depth PS3 play session. And then to close it out, a game that came out in 2010, but I feel like I thought it came out much earlier, but I spent so much time with it. One of my fondest memories is Afterburner Climax. It was a download-only Afterburner game, high-definition Afterburner game. It is a wonderful game. In fact, I would say it's my favorite Afterburner game. It was just like Sega at its best, I think, coming up with a fun, addictive, arcade-style game. And it captured everything I loved about Afterburner, put it in high definition, and it was challenging. It had a lot of interesting unlocks. The more you played it, the more you could do with your various aircraft. So, I played the heck out of it, and it's one of the few modern games that has disappeared. I remember it was delisted from the PlayStation and Xbox stores for whatever, I don't know what the reason was, but it was totally delisted. I want to say it was released on mobile sometime after that, but it was delisted from that. There is no way to play this game unless you have it downloaded on a PlayStation 3 or Xbox 360 console. I'd love to see them bring it to Steam or re-release it. But when I think of the PlayStation 3, I will think of many fun play sessions with that one. So fast forward to 2023. And my inspiration for this video was the fact that I went back to North Carolina for the first time in a long time, and to the town I was living in, and saw my old house and saw my old stomping grounds, as it were. And I was getting nostalgic. I couldn't believe it's been so long. So I just remembered those days fondly of new house, new life, PlayStation 3. And I decided, okay, when I got back, I was going to pick up some of the other games for the console that I missed out on, that were on the shelves when I first got down there. So some of the other launch titles or near launch titles. And play them and just kind of complete the process, as it were. So a couple of games that I picked up. Lair. Lair was a aviation-style dragon fighting game where you'd ride dragons and sort of shoot land and air targets. And tell you what, this one was tough to play. It used the motion controls, if you want to call it that. The Switch, the Nintendo Wii at the time, they did motion controls right. I kind of feel like the PlayStation motion controls on the original PlayStation 3 controllers, kind of like an afterthought, kind of like, oh, let's a last-ditch effort, let's try to capture that market too. Hey, we do motion. But it just didn't work well. It didn't feel good. And the graphics just don't hold up. Tons of loading times. It really felt like, I was looking at this palette of gray, brown, just janky, blah-like graphics. Resistance Fall of Man was another one that came out. I want to say that was like the launch game, like the system seller, basically a World War II era shooter. If the Nazis had allied themselves with aliens, and again, it was hard. Just the controls do not feel good in 2023. It just doesn't feel like a quality shooter, and I played a little bit of it, and I just couldn't get into it. Ridge Racer 7. Now, this game was within the launch window. I don't know if it was out immediately when the console launched, but let's say within the first year. And this is a game that helped me to crystallize my thoughts about the PlayStation 3. So I talked about Lair, I talked about Resistance. When I put this game in, it was like a veil was lifted. Ridge Racer, one of the few games that is 1080p, 60 frames per second. It looks like so few PlayStation 3 games, and it took me back to Virtua Tennis 3, which, again, 1080p, 60 frames per second. Or again, I haven't played that one, but I believe it was 60, or at least it was definitely 1080p. And that kind of ruined it for me in the sense that, wow, PlayStation 3 capable of a standard that sometimes we can't even hit today, and that's 1080-60. And here it was in 2007, and then you look at so many of the other titles, and they look like these brown, pixelated, slow, janky messes. And I feel like that aesthetic was quite prevalent in the PlayStation 3 and to a degree in the Xbox 360 as well. That the decision was made for whatever reason. Obviously, it's a resource decision. It's harder to make a good-looking 1080-60 game. But not having that smooth frame rate, not having those crystal clear graphics hurt. And I felt like the Xbox 360, which I got later on, they were able to kind of get closer to that target. PlayStation 3 never did. And I think so many of the earlier games tried and succeeded, and the later games just kind of gave that up. Case in point, Heavenly Sword. That was on the shelves back then. And again, try to play it today. It was a God of War type game. Obviously, a contemporary perhaps with God of War, just coming right after the PlayStation 2 God of War games. Didn't do it for me, but again, slow, 30 FPS, brownish color palette. So I got to kind of ask the question, well, what were some other games that ran at 60 frames per second, or that were 1080p, or both? Another game that came up as being both those things, 1080, 60, was NBA 07. Sony's NBA series. It was a surprisingly capable game, and it wasn't particularly fun to play now. It wasn't something that was going to occupy me now, but as a tech demo of what the PlayStation 3 could do, it was very impressive. Tony Hawk's Project 8 was, if not 1080p, it was 60 frames per second, or at least targeted that. I don't know if it always made it. I played the first sort of tutorials and introductory level, and I saw what it was trying to do as kind of an open world skating game. I never really liked skating games. I have no connection to them. I'm not very good at them, so it wasn't something that held my interest. But again, as a tech demo, it was something interesting. So there you have it, my PlayStation 3 experience. And like I said, it's a console that represents a good time in my life, a time that I look back fondly on, that it was intricately connected to that time of personal development. But as a console itself, I find it to be one of the most disappointing consoles long term. Again, because of the graphical choices that were made, and I feel like going back to it today, and not just these games that I mentioned that were in the launch window, but other games, like I tried to play Killzone 2, Killzone 3, some of the later MotorStorm games, which I'd picked up but never played. Some of the games that I remember liking, like some of the some RPGs, the first Ni no Kuni, which didn't look bad. Some of the WWE games that I enjoyed. The system just doesn't feel good. Like it's one of the least satisfying PlayStation systems to collect for because the games just perform worse. Take most games that came out on the PS3 and the Xbox 360. The Xbox 360 is the version to get and the version to play as a collector. I realize that maybe some PlayStation 3 variants are more rare and more collectible, but as far as playing goes, PlayStation 3 is very unsatisfying. Beyond that, from a collecting perspective, there's not a lot of interesting stuff on the PlayStation 3 that I have found. Most recently, I picked up the Shakedown Hawaii game and the Retro City Rampage DX physical versions, which I think were supposed to be like the last physical releases on the console that came out, within the past 5 years. So they were interesting. I remember I picked up Persona 5 on the console. I didn't play it. I played it on the PS4, but I thought that would be valuable. It wasn't. Perhaps my most valuable game is 3D Dot Heroes, which I've never played, but it's unopened. It's probably around $70, $80, something like that. But it just doesn't seem like there's a rewarding collecting community for it at this time. Of course, that could always change. But yeah, it's just that dichotomy of a console that I look back on so fondly from an experience standpoint, and that I really, really dislike from an actual hands-on gameplay standpoint.